The Wisdom of Gore. Number 5. The Dangers of Rigidity. Disorder is inherent instability. Civilized man doesn't understand stability. He's confused it with rigidity. Our political and economic and social leaders drool about stability constantly. It's their favorite word, next to power. Tom Robbins, even cowgirls get the blues. The initiates had their way of life, their ancient traditions, their given livelihood, which they claimed to be the highest on the planet. The prestige of their caste, their teachings, their holy books, their services, their role to play in the culture. Suppose that even now, if they knew the truth, what would change? Priest Kings of Gore. There's a Buddhist parable that begins with Siddhartha attempting to reach liberation by starving himself and practicing the austerities of the forest mystics. Yet he makes no progress. Then when he is close to death, he hears a sitar player and his companions passing by. The sitar player is asked by a companion, "What is the secret to making beautiful music?" And the sitar player replies, "The strings that are too tight will not strike a chord, and the strings that are too loose will not make a sound." This experience opens Siddhartha up to the flaws in the systems that he has been taught by the Vedics, that the denial of the world and austerity can move one towards liberation. And this in turn moves him towards adopting his middle path of being in the world, but not entrapped by it, an answer that a certain first-century Jewish carpenter of some renown will come to as well. When faced with the tribulations of life, it is tempting to evade our responsibility to deal with the problems that are before us. We seek some authority, be it a holy book, a guru, or traditions, to guide us into a decision by following some rule on how to handle the issue at hand, which was decided long ago in the distant past by someone who probably never had to face the decision that we are making. Let this go on long enough, and the result is a culture. Now, we have a negative reaction to the word cult. We characterize cults as being populated by unquestioning members who give up their will to a charismatic leader. Yet we excuse someone who acts in a manner in which might be detrimental to themselves or others with the excuse of, it's just their culture. Culture is never questioned, I notice. It shares that with the leader of a cult. It's no coincidence the two words are sharing a similar root. Oh, but I know, I hear you saying, but what about countercultural movements? When was the last time you met someone of a radical political party that truly questioned their party's beliefs? Look at our modern political struggles and tell me where someone rational, moderate, discerning, and wise can actually be found. I'll wait. Now that you've returned from your quest empty, and I've depressed you, I have even more bad news. It's going to get worse. In Priest Kings of Gore, the priest kings that follow Sarn have had plenty of signs that they should not obey him and follow him blindly into his war. The gradual loss of priest king productivity and the lack of births of new priest kings alone should have been an indication that Sarn's leadership is flawed. But even after years of his gradual and increasing failures, Sarm is still obeyed by the priest kings at large. He's even largely still obeyed by Misk, all because Sarm is the firstborn of the mother. He has inherited an office, a title, not unlike a medieval king, and by almost the same divine right, his failures are overlooked. Even after Sarm is refused to be acceptable by the mother of the priest kings, the closest thing they have for a god for themselves, and is publicly shamed by her at the giving of gur ceremony. Even after Sarm merely slays Misks in front of the priest kings and begins this war in which they attack their own kind, an event that has not happened in thousands of years of their history, the priest kings still follow along. Why? All cultures enforce rules of behavior upon their members and create structures that limit the ability of the mind to question them. In the novel, we notice that when Sarm first meets Tarl, he tells Misk to destroy Tarl. And when he is overridden by Misk saying the mother desires Tarl to live, Sarm is still insistent upon his objective. That's why it's laughable when later, Sarm thinks to twist Tarl to his purposes by pretending friendship. And this is more than just a plot device by Norman. I believe that Norman is trying to illustrate how rulers and people in power, accustomed to the constraints of their culture's paradigm, are blind to anyone outside that paradigm rebelling against its concepts. Once in my private religious school, a guest speaker was asked by a student, earnestly, "Why isn't everyone simply Christian?" And in a rare moment of honesty, the speaker responded, "Because Christianity does an excellent job of answering questions that people who are not Christian have never needed to ask." When a culture in our real world refuses to cease a practice that is detrimental but has long standing, say such as female circumcision, slavery, or a widow being burned with her husband when he dies, we that are outside of that culture often cannot understand why the horrible institution is continuing to survive. We fail to ask ourselves what traditions our own culture may have that are, in actuality, aberrant. Likewise, Norman's priest-kings have never thought to ask themselves if the culture and traditions they have been enculturated with are in fact virtuous, but abhorrent. We, the reader of the novel, have the advantage of distance, and we get to see the negative consequences of priest-king society through the eyes of Tarl Cabot, but the priest-kings themselves cannot. It's a case of not being able to see the forest through the trees. As the war progresses, Sarm's control of the priest-kings begins to slip. The evidence of his failure and unsuitability as a leader, as well as the flaws in priest-king society, become simply too apparent. But it requires a war to destroy the old order and create a new beneficial one. Why? What is Norman concluding about societies? What I believe Norman is critiquing is the tendency of all human systems to become rigid and inflexible. The warning signs of a system beginning to break down are always evident, and they're almost always ignored. Instead, the people that profit the most from the system as it stands deflect blame or awareness of the problems to a scapegoat. In the case of Sarm, this is the attempt to deflect his failures upon Misk, and turn the minds of the members of the culture away from practical and necessary change that would be in their best interest, rather than in the profit of the rulers. Such rigidity has been the fall of nearly every human society. The Persian Empire rose from tightly disciplined, virtuous warriors, and it fell under decadent, pleasure-seeking rulers. The Mongols arose from scattered tribes to make the largest empire the world has ever seen. But once the iron discipline of Genghis Khan and the harshness of their life was distant, the Mongols became like the people they had conquered, with their leaders emulating the behavior of those conquered peoples and their society changing, and that in turn caused the empire to fall apart. Rome began as a republic. Then it became a tyranny, and before it ended, it was supplanted by a theocracy, which fell apart because it had become so, in quotes, merciful that it could no longer effectively fight a war, and so morally corrupt that people constantly turned on one another rather than unite. Spain, England, France, Germany, Russia, all were once great empires that, due to a reluctance to change their culture or systems, failed in the face of the need to make improvements. The society will gradually descend into a state in which attempts to reform it or enact changes cannot take place other than by violence. This seems to be Norman's conclusion. And to be fair, that has indeed been the pattern of almost all human societies. And I'd love to put a hopeful "until now" on the end of that statement, but watching people in the street of my nation murder one another over a difference politically that could already be resolved by simply casting a vote has seriously made me doubt the moral and ethical worth and reasoning ability of a large portion of my fellow citizens. The only hope that Norman gives us is that this progression of history is that he believes that throughout history, those who are courageous are inherently more virtuous, loyal, and cunning than the unvirtuous and avaricial. Vika's turning on the priest kings to save Tarl, Misk's friendship, the survival of Tarl, Mul'alka, and Mulbaka during the war are Norman's appeal not only to valor, but to moral courage. And he may be right, because as I look through history, I have to note, Xerxes was defeated by Leonidas and his Spartans. The Roman Empire has risen and fallen, but the Jewish tradition the Zealots fought for is still with us. Napoleon's hunger for a world empire was defeated by Wellington. And to be fair, some other nations had a complementary part in that. Hail Britannia. Hitler's new Reich was shattered by the Allies, and Soviet Russia's glorious workers' revolution, which oppressed and impoverished its citizens, was broken without a shot needing to be fired, given up by the very same people who enacted it. It does seem that given long enough, men of great courage will always defeat evil, and that should give us hope. It is up to us to be those men and women of moral courage, to develop ourselves, expand our abilities, and discipline our minds. Unlike Tarl, we may never be a warrior in a foreign world swinging a sword against monsters, but we still have our internal battles of character to win and our external political battles to wage for a better world. We can only do this if we do not accept the rigid concepts that we have inherited are always right. We can never afford to become unquestioning citizens, little more than automatons, or priest kings, if you will. No matter what you believe, it doesn't believe in you, and that's true. We hate everyone by typo negative.